Hey y'all, I'm Mickey Gousset, and welcome back to another unscripted video. Now this video is about something that I encountered today that honestly is probably something I should have known, but I didn't really know until I was working with a customer today and encountered this error message, and it finally clicked what was going on and how to resolve it. So I want to see if you've been running into the same error message as well. Now, the problem we're going to be talking about is related to GitHub Actions, and specifically the Actions checkout workflow. Or not workflow, the Actions checkout action in a workflow. Because what we were seeing was we had one workflow where the Actions checkout action was working just fine. And it was working just fine on the one GitHub Enterprise we were running it on. But then when we tried to run it on a separate GitHub Enterprise, it was failing. The action could not check things out. So I've written a blog post about this. I'll show that to you in a second. And I've got some, hey, look, there's Milo. And I've got some images I'll show you of the error message. But what I want to do is walk you through the error message we were seeing and what the problem is and what the solution is. So let's get to it. All right, so first off, over at mickeygousset.com, I have written this up in a blog post. So if you're interested in reading it from a blog post perspective, I've written it up. And it's GitHub Actions checkout action fails with 2 possible error messages. And in the blog post, I'm going to basically go through everything that we're going to talk about here in this particular video. Now, you're going to see when this occurs, you're going to see one of 2 error messages. You're either going to see an error message like this, where it's going to be fatal, could not read username for https github.com, terminal prompts disabled when it's trying to run the checkout action. Or you're going to see this, fatal repository, your repository name not found, when it's trying to run the checkout action. So in order to explain why we're encountering these potential errors, we have to kind of explain a little bit about workflows in GitHub Actions and permissions. So here is a workflow that I've created in GitHub Actions, right? Now this workflow, ignore lines 3 and 4. Those are commented out for now. But this workflow just has a name. I run it manually. It has one job, runs on Ubuntu latest, and it uses the action checkout v4 action. Now, the thing you need to understand about workflows is the initial permissions that they're running with. So if we go to the settings for this repository, and we go over on the left-hand side under Actions, and we go to General, and you scroll down, then you have this section on workflow permissions. And this section on workflow permissions tells you what the default permissions are for the GitHub token when running workflows in this repository. So when you execute a workflow, it executes as the GitHub token by default. So you can specify by default that it either has read and write permissions. Now notice this says workflows have read and write permissions in the repository for all scopes. So we'll come back and talk about what that means in a second. But you can basically give it read and write permission to all the scopes, or you can just give it read permission to the contents of the repo and to the packages, to only those 2 scopes only. Now, between these 2, this is the more secure and what you probably should have as your default, because it means that if you want to give your workflow more permissions in this repository, you have to be very explicit with how you give those permissions. So what are we talking about when we're talking about these permissions and these scopes? Well, basically, a GitHub Actions workflow, and you can do this at the workflow level or the job level, is going to has the following scopes that you can set. actions, attestation, checks, contents, deployment, discussions, ID token issues. So these are all the different scopes that are available to you. Now, when you choose read-write permission as the default in your repository or in your organization or in your enterprise, then you're basically saying you're granting read and write to all of these scopes here. Whereas when you choose this one, repository contents and packages, you're granting read access to the content scope, and you're granting read access to the packages scope, and you're setting the rest of these scopes to none, meaning you can't access them at all. So when you're using these default permissions like this, for the most part, everything's actions checkouts should always work in this case, because it's always going to have read access to the contents. However, there are times when, especially when you've got the default access set to read, when you need to add in other permissions to the workflow. For example, if you're using OIDC, you need to add in ID token write to the workflow. Well, you can do that pretty easy. So if we go back to our workflow and we go to edit our workflow here, let's edit this, and we set the permission to ID token write. And if we commit this and check this in, we go over to our Actions tab, and we run this. Now remember, our default access on this is going to be read, or it could be read-write for that matter. And then we're adding, but we're specifically saying we want to make sure we have ID token write. So when I run this, what you're going to see, and give this just a minute to get started, is let's see what happens. So when I go to run this, the checkout action is actually going to fail. So give it just a moment to finish running. So you can see the checkout action has failed, and it has failed with fatal repository not found. So why did the checkout action fail? Because even though I explicitly said in the workflow file that I want to give ID token write, aren't I granting a default access to the repository based off of actions, general, and workflow permissions? Well, that's where you have to be careful, because when you go into your workflow file, so when you would go into this workflow file like we did, and you explicitly set the permissions by using the permissions keyword and then the different permissions that you want to set. When you explicitly set the permissions, this overrides those defaults that we saw in the setting. So what's going to happen is, what we've now done is it's going to set any of the permissions that you set here in the file. Ooh, I didn't mean to do that. That you set here in the file. But any permission that you don't set in the file is now going to be set to none. So that means the contents scope, which is what allows us to read the contents of the repository, is now set to none. And that is why we get that error message. So what we could do, since we want to make sure ID token is set to write, is we can then add in the contents scope and set that to read, because maybe that's all I need. And if we commit this change and we go over here to Actions and we run this, then what should happen now is when we hit that checkout action, because we have explicitly said we have content read, the checkout action should be able to check out our repository successfully. And you can see it did indeed check out our repository successfully. Now, couple of things. This only occurs when you're using private repositories or internal repositories. This is never going to happen to you using a public repo, because it looks like by default, a public repo always has content read, which makes sense because it's a public repo. So this is only going to happen on internal or private repos. Now you may be asking yourself though, okay, so we just saw how you created this error message, but why do we have two potential different error messages? Why do we have one error message for, or one error message here, but I also have a screenshot that's the same problem, but a different error message? And that comes down to whether you're using GitHub Enterprise Cloud or GitHub Enterprise Managed Users. Both of those are cloud products of GitHub, but they do authentication in a slightly different way. So if you're using GitHub Enterprise Cloud, you're going to get the message that we just saw, which is repository, or whatever the repository name is, not found. However, if you run this exact same scenario on an enterprise managed user account, then it's going to return with fatal could not read username for github.com, terminal prompts disabled. And there you go. Both of those error messages are only going to occur if you're adding the permissions, keyword, and scopes directly into your workflow file and you don't specify contents read. Now, I've got all of that written up in the blog post. I'll link the blog post to you. The blog post also has links to lots of different documentation, which could also help you understand this a little more. But this was a tricky one because I didn't realize that when you added the permissions keyword and you defined specific scopes, that all the other scopes were set to none. Now, it's explicitly in the documentation. It completely lays it out in the docs. I just missed it. But I did some searching for this error message, and I've seen where other people have run into this as well. So hopefully this will be helpful for you. So let me know in the comments below if you found this helpful, or let me know other errors you're running into in Actions, and let me see if I can help you solve those. I'd also really appreciate it if you'd like the video, if you'd subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All of those things help drive this channel out in front of more and more people. All right, thanks for watching.